Welcome to The Skinny for Friday, November 22nd. I'm Mitch Perry, the senior political reporter for the Florida Phoenix, and I'm joined this week, as always, by my colleagues Ray Roa, the editor-in-chief for Creative Loafing newspaper, and Ben Montgomery, an author and independent reporter. Good morning, guys.
Good morning. It's
Mitch.
cold out there. We look like a bunch of lumberjacks.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
But Ben and I were both wearing shorts, though. Even though
break out the fleece, though, on the torso. That's the only thing
Ben
that needs
has
to stay
socks,
warm.
socks
That's the
with
only
sandals
thing that you
today.
need to keep warm is the
Now,
torso.
can we say
The legs
Happy
are fine.
Thanksgiving? It's kind of early, but it's the last time we'll be on the air before Thanksgiving,
should.
so let's do that. You know, a couple big stories, of course, that happened in the last few days. You heard John Dingfelder talking about them, the situation with the Rays. You might remember last week we had Vincent Nowicki on there. Yes, we'll be getting to our guest there, John, in just a moment here. But also the Rays situation. So that is done deal now. I mean, they don't have the contract now, which I think
the bonds are
right? The
being
bonds
upheld.
have been issued out, and also, you know, we no longer have a Florida man as Attorney General nominee, but a Florida woman, and Pam Bondi. Any thoughts before we move on here?
Very interesting choice. I'll just point out that, I feel like I know Pam. I see her around occasionally. I bumped into her at a middle school soccer game a few years ago. She's
I did
like a Tampa person.
bartending shift for like a charity oyster catchers last year, and she was on the same shift as me. I mean, Tampa woman, very much so, former Democrat.
I will also point out that
I think she registered as a Democrat.
I
Way back.
I will also point out that she went to bat in a big way for the White House boys when they were sort of trying to get their voices heard. This is going back
the
5 or
Dozier
6
School.
years ago. She had a lot to do with helping USF get permission to do the exhumations at the Dozier School to reunite those remains with families. Pam is an interesting person, interesting choice in my pick.
Yeah, and probably after the whole situation with Matt Gaetz, probably, even though there's issues there, probably will not have a problem getting confirmed. Now, we're going to talk later in the program. We're going to talk to a journalist who recently wrote a story about maternity homes in Florida. These are homes, most of which are affiliated with churches or Christian nonprofits that often help women and teens as they try to flee abuse, age out of foster care, or leave drug rehabilitation. But here in Florida, the state allows most of them to operate without much oversight. So we'll learn about what's about that all in the second half of the show. But first, we want to talk about U.S. relations with Cuba, our neighbor to the south, and where they're at right now as in the last days of the Joe Biden administration. And with us to discuss this is in studio Al Fox, who for decades has worked to try to normalize relations between the two nations with this nonprofit, the Alliance for Responsible Cuba Policy Foundation. Al also has ran for Congress and U.S. Senate as a Democrat over the years here in Florida. Good morning, Al.
Good morning, Mitch.
Good to have you here. And then also joining us via Zoom is John Kavovich, who is the president of the U.S.-Cuba Trade and Economics Council, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization headquartered in New York City. John joining us by Zoom. Good morning, John.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Hey, great to have you here. And the reason for this discussion, as I said, is, we're in the last months of the Biden administration, winding up his 4 years in office. And, the relations between the U.S. and Cuba had seemingly ping-ponged since Barack Obama announced almost exactly a decade ago that he was ordering the restoration of full diplomatic relations with Cuba, opened up the U.S. Embassy in Havana for the first time in more than 50 years. But obviously, things changed. Donald Trump got into office. And he did certain things, and then Joe Biden came back. What the most recent things, and guys, Al and John, please, we'll get your thoughts about this. I believe the last few things that the Biden administration have done about this was back in May. The Biden administration allowed Cuban officials to visit Miami International Airport and tour the airport's security facilities, and they removed Cuba from a list of countries that are, quote, not fully cooperating with U.S. anti-terrorism efforts. Now, that's not the same as being taken off the list of U.S. State Department of Terrorism countries, joining North Korea, Iran, and Syria. Also, the Treasury Department implemented a 2022 rule granting Cuban entrepreneurs access to American banking services and financial platforms. But John Kavovich, let's start with you. That has basically been the most of what the Biden administration has done for the most part. Yes or no?
No.
Okay.
And the reason is that the Biden-Harris administration, has received criticism for purportedly not doing what candidate Joe Biden said he would do in 2020, which was reverse what the Trump-Pence administration had done. The problem with that was that, as well-intentioned as he walked into a situation where the Cuban government took some opportunities to just make it incredibly difficult for him to do any of that, particularly imprisoning people for protesting and other statements and actions relating to whether it was Iran, whether it was Russia, whether it was China, North Korea, Syria, Venezuela. So it just made it impossible. But the Biden-Harris administration did do one very important, they took a very important step, and that was in May of 2022. They authorized for the first time direct investment to, and direct financing for private companies in Cuba. That was a huge undertaking because the Cuban government had been saying that the U.S. government had not helped the reemerging private sector. Then they were saying that it was a sort of a Trojan horse. But in the end, the Biden administration did that, and that was just massive. Well, here we sit 2+ years later, and the Cuban government has still not issued the regulations that would permit that investment, permit that financing, and it doesn't just impact investors and individuals here in the U.S., it's every country. So it's been incredibly frustrating.
Al, any thoughts?
Well, I agree mostly with what John said, but I have a little different take. There's always a good reason why not to act regarding the embargo and these taking Cuba off the list of terrorist countries. And that is that Cuba did this or Cuba did that. When they had these so-called demonstrations in Cuba, there was some rioting, and people were arrested and people went to jail. When we have rioting in our cities, people get arrested and people go to jail. That so-called freedom demonstration that took place in Cuba
July
in July 2021, that was orchestrated out of Miami, clearly out of Miami. You'll never convince me that you have a spontaneous demonstration in July in Cuba at 9 o'clock in the morning, and at the same time you have a demonstration in Miami if it's not coordinated. So there's always a reason why not to act. But the bottom line is we are embargoing Cuba. They're not embargoing us. I think that the policy is beyond immoral. And when Barack Obama did what he did, well, who didn't like it? Well, let me start with who liked it. Everyone liked it. Corporate America loved it. The Cuban people liked it. The American people liked it. But 1,000 people in Miami didn't like it. 50 people in Tampa, Florida didn't like it. And 500 people in Union City, New Jersey didn't like it. But those are the people that have the power.
The Cuban exile community.
Can you understand, help those of us who aren't super familiar with this issue understand what segments you're talking about? Who are those people?
These are the what I call them Batista fascists that were part of the Batista government one way or the other, or their families were part of. Gloria Estefan sings songs about freedom and democracy. But she never tells you that her father was chief of security for Fulgencio Batista. Mario Lincoln Diaz-Balart and Jose Balart, they talk about that we need freedom and the oppression of the Cuban people and the Castro in the jails, etc.
The Congress members from Miami, yeah.
But they don't tell you that Fidel Castro is their uncle. Direct bloodline with Fidel Castro's first wife was the aunt to Lincoln's father's sister. Okay, so what's the relevancy of that? This is a family feud like the Hatfields and the McCoys. Okay, it's personal for a lot of people, and they keep her. To the rest of America, they could care less. They could literally care less.
So Al, let's talk about the fact, and you mentioned this before we went on air, that you were in Cuba recently and you saw its economic conditions are worse than ever. That has apparently been, one of the factors leading to hundreds of thousands of Cubans to flee the island just in the last couple of years, exacerbating the White House's migration woes as many Cuban migrants have opted via going through Mexico. I've been told by some, and I think you agree with this, that there's actually here in the Tampa Bay area, there's probably more Cuban folks from Cuba living here now than have ever lived here in the decades that people have escaped Cuba to come to America.
There's no question. I was there last December. Excuse me, my allergies. But, and I was shocked at what I saw. I'd been there prior to that, 2 years before that. And the city of Havana was always a safe city to travel. I would say there's no drugs, there's no crimes. That's not the case anymore. There's crime now in the city of Havana. Most of the people of Havana moved out they've come to the United States or come to other countries, and the people in the countryside have all moved into the city. They have blackouts. I'm at a so-called tourist restaurant, and the food was always pretty good in Cuba. and I ordered just a hamburger. And I said, "Can I have some mustard?" "Well, we don't have any mustard." "Well, have some ketchup." "Well, we don't have any ketchup." I'm at a nice hotel. It's a tourist hotel. I can't stay at the Nacional. No Americans can stay there anymore. They got a certain place where you can't stay. But at any rate, I was there the first morning. I had an omelet, blue cheese, which is one of my favorites. So the next morning I go to eat breakfast, and I said, to myself, I think I'll have the same omelet I had yesterday. And so I said, I want an omelet. We don't have any eggs. I said, "You mean you're out, like they'll be back in 10 minutes or something?" No, we don't have any eggs for today. So I had never experienced that. And in my opinion, the United States embargo, blockade, call it whatever you want to call it, today towards Cuba is stronger than at any time since 1959. Yet, there are a handful of people in Miami and a couple here in Tampa that are making money by selling goods to the black market. There are people in Cuba that's got some money. I went to a private club that was shocked, Michael Jordan even has a locker at this club. So, but it's just so de minimis. People are really suffering. Suffering.
We're talking right now. We're talking about Cuba and American relations with Al Fox of the Alliance for Responsible Cuba Policy Foundation, and also John Kavovich, who's the president of the U.S.-Cuba Trade and Economics Council. John, you do talk about business and the like. What is the trade? Do we have? I mean, we have an embargo, obviously, but there's still some type of trades going on, right, between the countries.
Absolutely, there are prohibitions, but in 1992, the Cuban Democracy Act was signed into law, and that reauthorized the export of healthcare products to Cuba. In 2000, there was the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act, which reauthorized the export of agricultural commodities and food products. That particular law, since December of 2001, when the first products went, has now accounted for about $7.5 billion in cash sales from U.S. companies to Cuba. So it's been phenomenally successful. It hasn't been, what everyone wants it to be all the time, but it's worked. And then during the Biden-Harris administration, as with the Obama-Biden administration, there were also decisions taken by the White House, by the State Department, by the Commerce Department, Treasury Department that authorized certain activities, whether it be the importing of products from Cuba, and anyone that uses Nestle Nespresso, there is Nespresso capsules with coffee from Cuba. They brought in at one point charcoal. So there are products that have come in. The charcoal ran into some issues with the lawsuit from people who purported to own the land on which that charcoal was sourced, and then that charcoal stopped being imported. But there are these activities. And then also the Biden-Harris administration has allowed for the export of vehicles to Cuba, electric vehicles, gas vehicles, and this year we'll hit about $50 million worth of vehicles going to Cuba. And those are, from passenger vehicles. First Tesla went to Cuba, to trucks. And so there's increasingly every month more and more of a percentage of products that are being sold to Cuba are going to the private sector, to the reemerging pymes, as they're referred to in Cuba. So that's always good. If I may, to go back to one thing you mentioned about almost 10 years for the Obama administration. And one of the reasons that the Trump-Pence administration was able to roll up like a carpet almost all of the Obama-Biden administration initiatives was because the Cuban government refused to let U.S. companies dig deep. They only let U.S. companies superficially have a presence in Cuba. For example, Marriott with one hotel management contract, the cruise lines pulling into the harbor, dropping people off, putting them back on the boat and going away. But accounting firms, law firms, retail, wholesale, manufacturing, assembly, they all were looking for opportunities to go into Cuba. And had the Cuban government authorized them, there would have been thousands and thousands of Cubans under the employment of U.S. companies. And that would have made it a little more difficult for the Trump-Pence administration to do what it did. And now we're coming back into a Trump-Vance administration where they may likely roll back or try to roll back some of what's been happening under the Biden-Harris administration. But there is one difference, and that is that the Biden-Harris administration has allowed companies to go a little deeper and build some roots, and the Cuban government has as well. But we still have that stinger, and it's like a wasp stinger, and that is the Biden-Harris administration says you can now invest in and provide financing to Cuban private companies, and the Cuban government says we're not interested. And had that not been the case, as we're now less than 60 days away from a new occupant of the Oval Office, there would have been companies down there, Cuban companies, that even met some of the most critical definitions of private companies, because there's some of the said, hey, these are government companies transitioning to private, but even some of the purest, they would have expanded, they would have had financing from the U.S., they would have had investment from the U.S., and that would have been more of that root system that would prevent any dislodgement. And unfortunately, we don't have it.
Right. Let's talk about the fact this past week, actually, is a handful of members of Congress, including Barbara Lee from California, Jim McGovern from Massachusetts. They wrote to President Biden urging immediate sanctions relief for all the Cuban people amid these widespread blackouts that Alfonso mentioned. Since 2022, over 800. Okay, well, I'm just looking at my notes here. Over 850,000 Cubans have sought refuge in the U.S. The ongoing collapse of essential services, particularly electricity, has further exacerbated this exodus. That's what this letter said. They requested that Biden remove the state sponsor of terror designation, expedite emergency humanitarian aid and technical assistance, issue safe harbor letters to address over-compliance with sanctions, suspend sanctions impeding aid, and facilitate energy infrastructure repair and modernization. John, going to you first. Obviously, I don't want to say this is a dead letter, but do you see Biden doing anything in these last weeks in office on Cuba at all?
Waste of time, waste of paper, waste of effort. These members of the House and even some members of the Senate, they keep going for these shotgun blasts. Do all this stuff. Where the business community, one reason we've been successful is because we use rifle shots. We go very narrow, very targeted, and try to make certain that as many stakeholders are involved as possible. But what do they think would happen? If President Biden today were to go, okay, we're going to remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, we're going to remove whatever other prohibitions are out there. For example, one that impacts us, which the Obama-Biden administration allowed U.S. banks to have correspondent accounts with Cuba banks, but said no to Cuba banks having correspondent accounts with U.S. banks, meaning money couldn't go back and forth directly. That was asinine then. Trump didn't do anything. Biden didn't change that. That was really stupid because it imperils the ability of the investment and financing and imperils the ability of just normal transactions. But having said all of that, if the Biden-Harris administration were to go and make all these changes now, what do they think is going to happen on the 20th of January? The Trump-Vance administration is going to put it all back there. But that's part of the problem. First, yes, they're going to reverse everything. Second, it builds momentum for the Trump-Vance administration to look at other things that they can do, because what does it do? It puts Cuba on everybody's radar. And right now, the smart play for these NGOs, organizations, lobbyists, members of the Congress is shut up. Don't talk about Cuba, because you don't want to make Cuba or change in policy a rallying cry for the 119th House and 119th Senate, and who's going to come into the White House and the State Department, because we already know that the new administration is going to have people in it who know what they're doing relating to sanctions, who are Cuba-focused or have been Cuba-focused, and why give them any more energy? Why give them another Red Bull or bull drink when you don't have to.
Well, of course, the biggest one you're talking about in terms of somebody new coming in the administration is Marco Rubio, the senator from Miami, who's been nominated to be the Secretary of State. Al Fox, your thoughts about Marco Rubio about to become the next Secretary of State when it comes to Cuban-American relations?
Yeah. Well, I agree with John about the waste of paper and all this effort, but this is, it's that those people that support the removal of the United States embargo towards Cuba, the American public, they pat us on the head every once in a while with a letter here and a letter there and a strong statement, but it's totally meaningless and it's not going anywhere. I might be the wrong person to be asking about Marco Rubio because I think he's just a complete fraud, creation of the extremist Cuban-American community in Miami. He was the darling of the late Joe Mascanosa, who put him into politics. He was a runner in Bob Doyle's campaign when he was 15 years old. But he's very articulate. He's very charismatic. He's very likable. But he wanted to go to the bathroom without the powers to be in Miami, the Cuban-American community. They tell him what to do, and how to do it.
So as John mentioned, not trying to mention the fact that Cuba is kind of like low key. Again, we're talking about it right now, but it's hardly on the front pages right now in terms of American foreign policy when you're talking about other conflicts going around the world. But certainly here in Tampa, there's a lot of people who care about this. It's going forward, as you mentioned a few minutes ago. The relations have probably never been lower in terms of trying to get the sanctions removed, and that's not going to happen in the next 4 years at all.
Yeah, everything is, we always say, a lot of people make the argument, well, Cuba's got to do this and Cuba's got to do that, okay? I had to have a different approach. That's pretty much what Barack Obama did. Let's just do this, lift the embargo as much as we can, and see what happens. And I can tell you, the Marriott Corporation, the cruise lines, they like doing business in Cuba. But they're not going to jeopardize, if you make $10 in Cuba and $1 million outside of Cuba, you're not going to jeopardize that $1 million by falling on the sword for Cuba. That's one of the ironies. Cuba doesn't have anybody that's got any clout to do anything. Mm-hmm. And so until the Marco Rubio types wake up one morning and say, that's our bloodline, that's our people, they're suffering tremendously, and they are. I have a friend that I've known now for 20 years in Cuba, and he had one of those little crappy Russian cars. I forget, what are they called, John?
Belada?
Yeah. And it was his car. It was a crappy car, but it was his car. And he now tells me that he has to walk 4 miles one way every other day to get his mother's insulin because there's no gas to put in his car for 2 years now. Okay? Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I mean, you can't go to the bathroom in Cuba without the government being involved in some. I get that completely. But Cuba's a small, insignificant sovereign country, okay? And it's in our national interest to do business with Cuba, okay? Believe me, I took 3-star Marine General Michael DeLong to Cuba, and it was interesting. We had a meeting with Fidel Castro and watched them go back and forth, and Fidel Castro said to General DeLong, General, we pose no threat to America's national security. And General Long said, well, hell, we know that, just like that. He said, well, hell, we know that, But it was interesting because Cuba poses no threat, and the Soviet, no one's going to do what they tried to do back in the Cuban Missile Crisis to put missiles in there, because we then would step in and stop it again.
Let me ask you, Al, as Mitch was alluding to, here in Tampa, we feel closer to Cuba than they probably do in Key West. And we're always thinking about Cuba. This weekend there'll be a dominoes tournament at the Marty Maceo Club. Right. For people who've either lived here for a long time or new people who sense that influence of the Cuban culture and love the Cuban culture, how should they continue to think about it, right? Beyond Cuban sandwiches and Cuban coffee and murals. Like, how can they get more involved? I know there's organizations that collect money for Cuba and things like that.
It's a great question, and the answer is very simple. 99% of all those Cubans you're talking about agree with me 100%. Just lift the blockade, lift the embargo, and see where we go. But they won't publicly say it because what happens when the last year almost now, the Cuban ambassador visited Tampa,
Yeah, maybe we should just because we're going to move on in a few minutes, but I do want to bring that up. So it was a year and a half ago or so. The Cuban ambassador to the United States, Lianas Torres Rivera, she met with a handful of special local political and business officials at Mise en Place here in Tampa. And the event, and Al, you were there, right?
Yeah, I was there.
I saw the video footage of that. And this event was interrupted by two men: 84-year-old Roberto Pisano, a prisoner for 18 years under Fidel Castro, and then his 42-year-old son Rafael. They broke in. They captured us on cell phone video. Now, what happened after that was really interesting because a group of Tampa Bay area Republicans in the legislature then held a news conference a couple days later in Tallahassee, led by Tampa's Jay Collins. They introduced a resolution, quote, condemning the tyrannical Cuban government and the Tampa City Council member and Hillsborough County officials who, I'm reading for this resolution, March 3rd, 2023, entertained the Cuban ambassador and other Cuban officials at a dinner meeting in Tampa in complete disregard of the brutality of the Cuban regime and the blood that has been shed by those who rose up in opposition. And that resolution called out three local officials here in Tampa, City Council member Guido Maniscalco, Hillsborough Clerk of the Court Cindy Stewart, who lost a couple weeks ago, and Hillsborough County School Board member Karen Perez. Now, ultimately, this resolution never came to a vote, but it basically put a chill into the movement for improved Cuban relations here. And Al Fox, let me go back to you, because this is so different than like a decade ago when Kathy Castor led the movement. Kathy Castor went to Cuba. She was the first, I believe, Florida Congress member, maybe wrong, to call for the end of the sanctions. It was a real big deal. Right. And we saw what Obama did a year later in terms of trying to restore relations. We are so far away from that, and talk about that incident last year, though, if you could, because that just, and then the way that the legislature reacted to it, I felt it was in the McCarthy era. Like, who did you meet? What did you meet the Cuban ambassador? It was really a really dark moment there, I thought.
Well, it was, and that's your answer to your question, Ray. The rest of the people say, hell, I don't want to put up with my life was threatened. You won't believe the emails that I get. Well, Kathy Katz said, hell, I don't need that headache, so I'll just flip, go back the other way, and everybody's happy. But in their hearts, they know they're wrong. They know it. They talk in private, and what I tell people, don't tell me in private anymore, Al, you're doing a great job, a wonderful thing, Say that publicly. Don't say it privately, and so here it's like we just keep going around in a circle, and then.
Al, I wonder if you couldn't go back for a second to what we were talking about just before we went on, and give us the history of how our wet foot, dry foot policy with Cuba has confused immigration in other places.
Well, as a generalization, I can make a strong argument that the mess that we have in the border today, our immigration policy, stems from all the special privileges that we gave to Cubans. And how did that come to happen? Wealthy Cubans gave money to American politicians to pass laws that apply only to Cubans, whether it was wet foot, dry foot. All you had to do is come from Cuba, come to the border, Brownsville, Texas, say, I'm fleeing Fidel Castro, I'm up, come right on in.
Yeah.
No questions asked on other. And that grew, and more other countries looked at it. When Venezuela, nobody cared about the poor people in Venezuela before Hugo Chavez came to power. All of a sudden, we're worried about the poor people in Venezuela and so forth. So then the rich Venezuelans, they came to Miami. They already had a home there. They went to New York. They already had a home there. And they did the same thing the Cubans did. They gave money to American politicians to pass laws that apply only to Venezuela. So now you have Venezuelans and Cubans just showing up at the border, come right on in. We don't know who they are or what they are. So then all those other countries in Latin and Central America, and particularly Haitians, if you came from Haiti to the border, illegally, you were deported, as all other countries. Well, then it became so it was uncontrollable, and there's no question that we have to close the border. But the fact is that we give asylum to even today. Barack Obama was actually deporting Cubans.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, he had a wet foot, dry foot.
Right.
Well, Obama did, yeah.
And that the people don't. The wet foot, dry foot policy is insane. If you came from Cuba and said you're from Cuba to our border, you got $300 a month, food stamps, aid to education, health care benefits, and a green card to work. Well, hell.
Wow.
Why would you want to come?
Did you all know that?
You tell the people in Haiti, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Colombia, you'll have the same rights that the Cubans come.
I had no idea that was the case.
People would tell me, Al, I see your point, but Al, these people risk their lives in shark-infested waters, 90 miles, and, to come to freedom. I said, look, That's it. They only got to come 90 miles. You tell the people in Haiti, Guatemala, Colombia, El Salvador, you now have the same privileges that the Cubans have. There'll be so many inner tubes and rafters, you could walk that 600 miles. Okay.
Wow. We're about to end the segment. John, we'll go back to you, John Kavovich. Your last thoughts here as, again, we go into the last couple of months of the Biden-Harris administration, go into the Trump-Pence administration. And I know you've already talked about this, but again, what your thoughts are about Cuban-American relations going forward here.
Well, this is the 30th anniversary of the creation of the U.S.-Cuba Trade and Economic Council. And when I look back at those 30 years, the most productive years were when Fidel Castro was president of Cuba. Why? And that was because the people around him, his staff, were practical. They had an ideology, but they didn't let the ideology stand in the way of what might be a good decision. They were risk takers, and they were evaluating opportunities, not 100% good for us, terrible for someone else, or vice versa. They will look, can we make something of this? Maybe the U.S. is allowing this to harm us, but we think we're more talented than they are. And I'll give you one example, the big food show back in 2003. 1,000 U.S. business people in Cuba and selling agricultural commodities and food products. And when President Castro was touring the event, he at one point we were talking and he said, so is it successful? And I said, that depends on you. And he said, why does it depend on me? And I said, because you're the one with a checkbook. And he gave out a big laugh, and then he spent, almost $80 million. So it was a huge success. This current generation that's there is incapable of that kind of thinking. The staff around them are incapable of that type of thinking. The Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Carlos Fernandez de Cosio, comes to the U.S. and goes and speaks to students at Rutgers University rather than trying to engage with business people. And what this government has done in Havana is make Cuba irrelevant. And they've worked really hard at it, and they've achieved their goal because U.S. companies don't care because they know that the Cubans are not responding, particularly investment, financing, just doing everything that would say, look, we know there are sanctions, we don't like them, they're harming us, but we think that we can take these sanctions and do something good. And that's the difference between Cuba and a China and a Russia and an Iran and a Syria and a Venezuela, where they all look at sanctions, they're like, this sucks, but we need to survive. So we're going to try to figure out a way around them. With Cuba, their strategy is, there's all these sanctions, so what are we going to do? We're not going to change to try to absorb them or get around them. What we're going to do is just go and beg other countries to give us money so we can stay the way we are. And that's, that's the environment that the Trump-Vance administration is going to find. And what I was talking about Marco Rubio, regardless of who created Marco, the fact is that he has one talent going into his new job that's going to be incredibly impactful, and that is he speaks Spanish. And he'll be the first Blinken speaks French, but Rubio will be able to travel throughout the Americas, will be able to speak directly in media in the language that the hemisphere speaks. Yeah. And that's going to be incredibly important. I'm not saying that what he's going to say is great or not great, but he's going to have that communicative capability that's going to really be important.
John Kavovich is the president of the U.S.-Cuba Trade and Economics Council. John, thank you so much for joining us today from New York City.
John, be well.
Thank you.
Okay,
thanks, Al.
Thank you. And Al Fox, Al, hang around here. We're going to go to a different segment here, but maybe we'll get a chance. Do you want to say one quick thing?
One quick thing?
Yeah.
That in 2006, when I was running for Congress here, I went to Cuba and had a meeting with Congressman Delahunt. That was the purpose of the meeting. When the meeting was over, and I go to bed at night, a lot of nights thinking, why would he tell me this? The meeting is over, and Fidel Castro comes up to me, and he put his arm on my shoulder, and in English, he said, Albert, walk with me. And we went walking down this hall, and he said, I want to wish you good luck in your campaign for the United States Congress. He said, say whatever you have to say about me, as bad as you want, I understand. I go to bed at night saying, why would a man tell me that? He understands, okay? He does understand. And unfortunately, some of what John said is good, and I agree with a little bit, and not so much. The fact is that to compare Cuba with Venezuela and China and Iran sanctions, Cuba is a drop in the bucket compared to those countries. Okay, they literally are nothing. They're non-players in it. They have no military. They have nothing. Okay, so to compare them on sanctions with Iran is, and then here is the bigger problem: the United States sanctions the United States sanctions that we have on Cuba is substantially greater than any sanctions we have on any other country in the world.
Al Fox is the head of the Alliance for Responsible Cuba Policy Foundation. Al, hang around here. We're going to maybe get back to you the last couple of minutes of the show. But I'm going to give it now back to Ben Montgomery. We're going to go to a different direction now, Ben.
Yeah, and actually our next guest could have joined this conversation because she covered immigration during the Trump administration. Before joining Reveal, which is the outfit she works for now, Laura C. Morel is a reporter for Reveal, covering reproductive health. And she brought us last month now. We actually got delayed talking about this by a couple of hurricanes. But last month she reported, in conjunction with the New York Times, wound up running on the front page of the New York Times, a story about Florida maternity homes. Now, these are homes that often give a fresh start for pregnant women who might be on the brink of homelessness, or they might be, coming out of rehab or something like that. It's often a critical moment in lives of pregnant women. And they seek help at one of their few options, which are nonprofit maternity homes. These are sort of all over Florida. And the issue raised by the story and by the reporting that Laura did by interviewing lots and lots of people who'd spent time at these homes, and also the players and the volunteers and the employees of these homes, is such that the state doesn't really have much oversight when it comes to these homes, and there are often some spaces where abuse can happen. And so without getting into the details, we welcome to the program Laura Morel. Laura, how are you?
Hi, Ben. I'm good. How are you? Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for joining us. I wish you could have been a part of the first part of this hour because, you have such a broad knowledge of immigration, especially during the 4 years of the Trump administration. But let's talk about these maternity homes. How did you get onto this story, and what did you learn?
Yeah, so I cover reproductive health, and I'm based in Florida. I'm in the Tampa Bay area. And while I was working on some other unrelated stories, I came across some information about a maternity home in Florida. And that sort of sparked my interest, and I started, digging into it and doing some research, and found that there were many maternity homes in Florida. In fact, I was able to find 27 of them. And historically, when we think about maternity homes, these were places where, more than half a century ago, pregnant, unmarried women could give birth, and then they would place their babies up for adoption. Most of these places closed by the 1970s when birth control became widely available. So I was really interested in learning more about the mission of today's maternity homes. How was it different, and what it was like for the women who rely on their services today.
And you began to learn that these homes require residents sometimes to agree to strict conditions that that might in some cases dictate their financial decisions, limit where they go, limit in some cases who they talk to, right?
Yeah, that's right. For example, in Naples, Florida, there's one home in particular that required women to get permission before they could leave the property, and to download a tracking app on their phones. They also had to lock their phones in a safe overnight. And one of the women I talked to who experienced this actually shared a photo with me of the safe that ended up running with the story. We also found at least 6 homes that mandated attendance at morning prayer, at church services, Bible study as a condition of living at the home. And these were activities that a lot of the former members who were not religious said felt like religious indoctrination. A lot of other homes also had rules around cell phone use, not being able to use their cell phones at night or putting their cell phones away in the evenings, as well as a probationary period of 30 days or 2 weeks where they weren't allowed their cell phones at all.
That sounds interesting to me, but what do the homes say about the reason that these rules are in place? What is their defense of this sort of draconian these measures that stop women from talking to others?
Yeah, so many of the maternity home leaders I talked to told me that the rules were in place to ensure the safety of the women and their babies and children. Oftentimes, these are women who are, not in all cases, because there's a variety of different situations that would lead you to a maternity home, but a lot of the women are fleeing abusive relationships or are maybe recovering from addiction or just leaving environments that are unsafe for them. So these maternity home providers told me that these rules ensured that the women were safe, that, it made sure that they stayed away from these potentially dangerous situations and sort of provided some level of accountability for a lot of the women who, wanted to make changes in their lives and find jobs and stability. But again, it sort of creates this tension between, ensuring safety versus respecting the autonomy of women. Who oftentimes, were women in their late 20s and their 30s and even 40s, who, had always been independent and then found themselves in these programs where they felt really restricted.
A young mother, 33 years old, at Sunlight Home told you, I felt like Sunlight Home was dehumanizing, almost like we were criminals, not single mothers. What were the consequences for these women if they violated the rules?
There were a couple things that would happen. One of the things I did was I requested police reports for all of the maternity homes in Florida. And what I found over and over again is that the homes sometimes called the police when women violated rules or, maybe were in disagreement with staff or volunteers at the program. And these were for things that did not rise to the level of a crime, that in fact, in the police reports I have, police noted that, there was nothing that they could do in the situation. I'm thinking in particular about one woman who had the police called on her because she went to a Starbucks. This was a 29-year-old woman who left this home in Broward County to go to Starbucks, and the home ended up calling the police on her. And then another thing that happens frequently is that the women are evicted, oftentimes with very little notice. Sometimes, maybe they'd have 24 hours to pack up their belongings and leave the property. Other times the eviction was immediate. There was another woman I spoke to who had lit incense in her room, and that same night she was evicted with her 2 children.
How old were the children?
The children were, don't quote me on this, but they were about 5 and 8.
Wow.
So she had just moved in a week before with her kids, and this was sort of a last resource for her. She had been dealing with homelessness for a while, and she, lit incense that night. She wanted to sort of, make a calming environment in her room, and her kids were already asleep. And, staff walked in and told her that she couldn't do that and that she had to be evicted. The home did tell me that they had warned her a couple times. The woman I spoke to said she did not recall any such warnings. At the end of it, though, this woman ended up calling police on the home, and ultimately the home agreed to put her up in a hotel room for one night with her kids. But shortly after that, she went back to having to grapple with homelessness.
You write that more recently the homes have sort of experienced a nationwide renaissance. The number of homes has grown by nearly 40% in the past 2 years and now surpasses 450 nationwide, according to Heartbeat International, which is a national anti-abortion group that supports maternity housing. With the trend of states passing more restrictive reproductive rights measures, do you see the number of these types of homes continuing to increase? Is this sort of a growing thing in the coming years?
And is this lucrative at all for the people that run the homes?
Are they making money at it?
So, yes, I mean, I do think that there is going to be a continuing expansion of these kinds of programs. I have Google alerts set up basically so that I get news articles whenever there's a new maternity home that opens or expands somewhere in the country. And it's happening like every couple weeks. I'll get an alert about a new maternity home or, a place that is already expanding. I know of at least 2 maternity homes that are currently in the process of fundraising so that they could open their doors in the next coming years. And, I think it's sort of two factors, and it's a little nuanced. I think one of the biggest factors that has led to this sort of, renaissance of these homes is rent prices, right? And how the housing crisis and particular.
Right.
A lot of the women I spoke to, actually, the only reason they were at these homes, they had full-time jobs, but they could not afford housing on their own. In fact, one of the sources I talked to was actually an accountant. And she just could not find a place to live by herself as a single mom with her baby. So she ended up moving into a maternity home. So the housing crisis is huge and creates such a need for these kinds of services for women. And then on top of that, of course, we have these abortion restrictions. And I think what we'll see over time, and what Heartbeat International told me as well, is that because of these abortion restrictions, we will see a greater need of women in crisis pregnancies that don't have a support system, don't have anywhere to turn. And so these maternity homes end up being their safety net. And in terms of money, most of the homes that I looked at actually only relied on community fundraising and donations. And very, very few of them receive state or federal funding. And I think that's part of the, not being licensed piece of it, and sort of operating under the regulatory radar, is that they have the, freedom to, fundraise how they choose, and spend the money how they choose.
Laura, what about in Florida? How about state funding there at all? No.
There is a bit. There's one small bucket. It's specifically for crisis pregnancy centers. But and I think the number is now $25 million a year for crisis pregnancy centers in Florida. There are about a handful of homes around the state that get funding from that bucket, but it's a very small amount.
And that money, by the way, came out of the, I think the 6-week abortion, or was coincident, the same time?
Yes.
Yeah, they did that.
Money set aside to be directed to maternity
they said
homes.
They acknowledged, because people were saying, okay, you're going to basically ban abortion here in Florida. What are you going to do for these mothers? What are you going to, so they created $25 million.
You got to. It stands to reason with the establishment of that kind of pot that the providers would sort of rise up to claim that money. We're in line for more of these types of places. Laura, what I wanted to ask you is where this seems to maybe violate law is in the cases in which the homes require the mothers, the clients, if you will, to turn over their food stamps, when they get them, so that can go into a collective communal sort of grocery bank, right?
Right.
What's going on there, and how might that violate state law?
Right. So there's one home in particular in West Palm Beach, Hannah's Home of South Florida, where the women are required to hand over their EBT cards in order to pay for communal groceries. So how it would work is that you would turn over your card, and then staff would basically place like an Instacart order with the needs of all the women and babies and children in the home. The reason why this is potentially illegal is because under federal law, laws governing the use of food stamp assistance and SNAP benefits, if you are a shelter or a group home taking care of people within your residence, you need to have permission from the state in order to do this, in order to collect residents' food stamps. This home in particular does not have that specific permission. So that is where, the potential questions about legality sort of come from. It's also, sort of problematic in the sense of a lot of the women I talked to who were at this home said they sort of felt like they lost a lot of their autonomy and independence, giving over their EBT card, not being able to have the ability to go to the grocery store by themselves and pick out their own food and, learn how to budget and, learn how to like buy groceries in a way that, that you could cook food and have, be able to prep meals throughout the week. So it really limited these women and it, was very frustrating for a lot of them.
Laura, the amount of control exerted at these homes is outstanding in so many parts of your story. And I was trying to think outside of obviously prisons or rehab or anything like that, what other kinds of institutions exert this kind of control over the people that stay there?
I mean, I would say that all residential programs have some level of control. At shelters, whether it's domestic violence shelters or shelters for homeless people, rehabilitative programs, treatment centers, they're all rules, right? Because, you have people that have never met before, potentially living together, sharing a space, and you need to ensure that, people get along. But I think, what makes these homes in particular a little different is just this idea that they are mostly unregulated. There's no sort of external oversight. There's no external agencies sort of going in and inspecting and, making sure that these rules that are in place aren't violating people's rights or violating their autonomy. And I think that that's probably one of the biggest differences. Also, too, in terms of staffing, a lot of these places aren't staffed by folks who might have degrees in counseling and social work. They're staffed by people who mean well, right? These are people that have, I think, ultimately good intentions. They want to help these women, but they don't have any experience in residential care. And so I think because of that, that also sort of creates this avenue where these kinds of rules begin to exist, and it creates this tension.
And you may have mentioned this before, but 3 of the homes you looked at conducted random searches of rooms and belongings. What gets me is the first part of this. 2 required sexual abstinence.
Yes,
I guess they make them sign an agreement, or they're not in the bedrooms or monitoring these women privately, right?
Right. In a lot of cases, how it works is that the women who are entering these programs will sign an agreement up front, and the agreement will list all of the rules that they need to abide by during their stay there. And in a couple of the homes I looked at, that was one of the rules, was requiring sexual abstinence. So the women sign the agreements, and then, after that, they can shortly after that move in. It's just another, thing that, one provider in particular told me it just comes down to safety. And sort of, from their perspective, ensuring some level of accountability for the women. But again, sort of this nuanced issue of, independence, right? Like how much independence do these women get in these homes? And I think, for a lot of these homes, I would say it's very little. And that causes a lot of frustration on the part of the women who live there, who, have nowhere else to go. I talked to one woman who told me that it was either sleep in her car with her baby or move into a maternity home. So these are the kinds of decisions that a lot of women who don't have resources in the state of Florida are dealing with today.
Laura C. Morel is an investigative reporter for Reveal. You can find her story about Florida maternity homes on our blog at wmnf.org. Laura, thank you so much for this important reporting, and we really appreciate you bringing this to us and also joining us to tell us about it today.
Yeah, I hope you can join us for a follow-up as this legislative session unfolds, too, see if they'll touch or increase that pot of money.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to be back on. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks.
Hey, but we have about a minute left. We have Al Fox still hanging out here. Al, you were involved slightly with the RFK Jr. presidential campaign earlier this year. We only have a few seconds left to go. What do you think, your thoughts about him being nominated for Health and Human Services Secretary?
Well, I support it because I can tell you that 3 months before he left the Democratic Party, the thought never entered his head. And 30 days before he threw in with Donald Trump.
Support Trump, you mean? Never thought, yeah.
Yeah, never. However, you got to put yourself in his position. Here, the Democratic Party and the Biden-Harris team would not even return his phone call. And he tried on numerous occasions. Chris Cuomo on national television said, "Hey, do you want me to run traps for you? Maybe I could get you to get a phone call returned." So put yourself in his shoes. His party excludes him,
right?
And Donald Trump's kissing him left and right.
And he's even now eating McDonald's, apparently, according to that.
Well, that's
the brainworm told him to do it, Mitch. Come on, man.
You see that all of these stories about the guy. I visited with him 3 times, and I was pretty hard on asking him these questions. And as someone whose image is tarnished by propaganda, I'm very sensitive to that.
It's respect.
Thank you, Al. Great to have you here today.
Al Fox, Laura C. Morel. Thank you so much for joining us today on The Skinny. On behalf of myself, Ray Roa, Mitch Perry to my left, Ben Montgomery to my right, Skip Sassy on the board today for us, Irene Matthews on the phones. Please stay tuned to WMNF Tampa. Joel and Shilke is in Studio 1, ready to give you art in your 2 little ears.
Are we all? Yeah.